Good evening. Ask you to open your Bible tonight, Book of Daniel, chapter 5. Book of Daniel, chapter 5. We come to the end of, at least the way we're telling the story of Daniel this week. And so that's where we're at, and that's what's left. Daniel, chapter 5 in your Bibles tonight. And while you're settling in and finding that opening, let me tell you how much, again, I have just thoroughly enjoyed the time this week. Really just appreciate the spirit of this congregation. Really appreciate all the conversations, the encouraging words. Good to reconnect with old friends and people I've known other times, other places. Great to be with Ben and Nikki. Know you appreciate them, and I appreciate them as well. Thoroughly enjoyed, and thank you to all those who've had me over for a meal or invested in me in that way. Thank you for that kind hospitality. Enjoyed all of that as well. And to the elders, thanks for the invitation to be here. I never take it for granted when elders risk their relationship with their congregation and invite somebody in. You never know. And I do appreciate the confidence and the opportunity to be with the flock that you oversee in the Lord. Thank you for that honor and that privilege as well. It's been my joy and my privilege to be with you this week. All right, Book of Daniel, chapter 5. Got your Bible? Let's read here for just a moment to get going this evening. And so Belshazzar the king held up a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles. He was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. And when Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, his concubines might drink from them. And so they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem. And the king and his nobles, his wives, his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine, and they praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. All right, so here we are. It's Wednesday night, and we have now literally come full circle from Sunday morning, because you remember in Sunday morning when we looked at Daniel chapter 1, well, it's one of the things that we noticed just briefly, but we did notice. We noticed that when Nebuchadnezzar took or put Jerusalem under his thumb, what did he take? He took the vessels of the temple of God. And what did he do with those things? He put them in the houses of his gods. As a way, remember, in their world, ancient mindset, that was a way of saying our God is better than your God. We have conquered you. We have your God's stuff. That means our gods are stronger than your gods. That's why we now worship our gods with your God's stuff. And it's very important. A Hebrew narrative, the way the Old Testament tells stories, it's actually very sparse on details compared to novels that we often read and so forth. When details are given, make note of them, because they are going to be relevant more often than not, somehow, some way, somewhere down the road. And so here we've come full circle. And at the beginning of the Babylonian Empire, the vessels of the temple of God are there. And we come literally to the world's last night, to the empire's last night. And what's there again? The vessels of the temple. When the vessels of the temple show up in the book of Daniel, something's about to change. Something is happening. Somebody is rising and somebody is falling. That's what's going on. When the temples of the vessel of God show up in the book of Daniel, judgment is at hand. And chapter 1, it was God's judgment on his people. Tonight it's God's judgment on Babylon. And so Belshazzar throws a drunken feast. Now, here's the thing you have to understand. You have to understand as we go into this story tonight. It's not that Belshazzar didn't realize that the Medo-Persian Empire was at hand. No, Babylon was under siege. Herodotus tells us a lot about this, or the ancient Greek historian Herodotus tells us some stories about this. But long story short, here's the thing. Ancient times, modern times, you don't move a large enough army to take major international class cities without people noticing. They knew the Medo-Persian Empire was at hand. In fact, the Medo-Persian forces had been whittling down Babylon for a while, just like Babylon had whittled down Assyria at the beginning of our studies here a few days ago. That's what the Medo-Persians have been doing to Babylon for a while. And so what really begins to happen here then is Belshazzar doesn't realize, they're at the city gates. No, he knows Babylon is under siege. He knows that's what's going on. So why does he throw a party? A couple of reasons. Number one, he throws a party Because Babylon's walls were legendary for their size and their strength. Yes, we may in one sense be under trouble, but the reality is we have big enough walls, we can keep them out. They'll get tired, and go home eventually or give up. That was one of the ways that sometimes ancient sieges were broken, was that the city under siege had enough resources and big enough walls and fortifications that they just really were impregnable. Babylon had a lot of faith in her walls, and they were legendary in their size and their scope. And the other reason that Babylon could have great confidence in this moment is one of the ancient tactics of siege, when ancient armies put cities under siege, surrounded them and held them and kind of shut them up in there, was we will starve them out or we will make them thirsty enough. Well, Babylon had water. They weren't going to run out of water. There was a stream that flowed through the city. There were fortifications to protect those ways in. And so Babylon didn't have to worry about running out of water or running out of food. In theory, they were well prepared to just wait these guys out. These guys would give up and go home eventually. So why does Belshazzar throw a party? Because they really don't think they can fall. Number two, the second reason he does it is it's good PR. It's good PR, right? Think about it. I mean, now like then, when there are crises going on, what does the president or one of his spokespeople do? They basically go out and they say it's not as bad as it looks. And so what goes on here is Belshazzar brings in 1,000 of his nobles and basically says, let's have a party, let's act like it's good times. I'm not worried. You shouldn't be either. You got to put on a brave face for the troops. And so Belshazzar is making it look like there is no big deal here. And so what you have here is a picture of a virtual orgy with the best and the brightest, the elites, the leadership of the empire. But of course the irony is in the pagan way that Belshazzar tries to boost morale in a city under siege, the irony is he's being a pagan, he really commits blasphemy against God. Because when he begins to realize that, hey, this is a good time, the wine starts flowing, let's bring out these old temple vessels. Now stop and think about, again, the symbolic significance of this. Why would you do it at what was otherwise a time when the evening news was not giving you good coverage? Because, again, we're under attack, we're under siege, the Medo-Persians are at the gates. Why would you do that? It's a reminder of the time when times were good, when we were the conquerors, not the ones under siege. What do politicians do? They do photo ops with symbols of our strength, of our past accomplishments. And so Belshazzar has them bring out the stuff that they have captured in the past that reminds them of the greatness of our rise, the greatness of Nebuchadnezzar when we were the world-class city and everybody was afraid of us. It was a reminder of previous victories against others. We can beat any army, any god. I mean, take Yahweh, for instance. We beat him once upon a time, and we weren't afraid of him despite all the stories about that god. We shouldn't be afraid now. And so that's where we're at, and that's what's going on. Still have your Bible? Let's read a little bit more. This is the ultimate PR. This is the ultimate tail wagging the dog kind of situation. And the story continues. Suddenly, and again, if you're one of those Bible highlighters, underliners, what have you, that's a word you notice. Suddenly. We're going to do something with that, but keep an eye on that word. Suddenly, the fingers of a man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. And then the king's face grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints were slack, and his knees began to knock together. It's easy to read those words, but I want you to feel what he is feeling. I want you to use your imagination, and I want you to think about what that must have been like in that moment. Because again, remember, these are Babylonians and Chaldeans. Go back to what we've talked about earlier in the week. These are superstitious people. When Daniel's getting his Babylon U education, right? They're learning about divination and astrology, signs and omens. That's part of this world for them. And so, even though Belshazzar is trying to put on a brave face, all is well. It's not as bad as it looks. When you see something like that at a party that's supposed to be about it's okay, and you know you're under trouble, are you going to take it as a good omen or a bad omen? This probably isn't good news. And his face grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack, his knees began knocking together, and the king called aloud to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and diviners. Boy, how many times have we seen that in these stories? And we've seen it enough times that you know what's going to happen, don't you? He brings in all the Ivy League PhDs, and what happens? They're not going to have the answer. And so once again, we see a Babylonian king calling for his Ivy League PhDs, and the king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, any man who can read this inscription and explain its interpretation to me shall be clothed with purple, have a necklace of gold around his neck, and have authority as third ruler in the kingdom. Let me stop right there for just a second. Here's how accurate the Bible is. Back in earlier centuries, skeptics, in the early Enlightenment, looked at that statement of the third ruler and said, "Oh, this is proof that the book of Daniel is historically inaccurate because he should have been the second ruler, right?" No, but then we kept digging in the Middle Eastern desert, and we found some inscriptions, and we discovered that the Bible is staggeringly accurate. We were the ones who didn't know ancient history, because the truth of the matter is Belshazzar was actually the second ruler of the kingdom. He was the prince regent. The true technical last emperor of Babylon was a guy named Nabopolassar. But Nabopolassar spent a lot of the later years of his reign in absentia, going around doing other things, and he left Belshazzar in charge. And boy, isn't that just how it works, man? You leave your young son in charge, and it all falls apart. Dad should have stayed in the office and stayed on top of things. Belshazzar was the second. He was the prince regent of the empire. Dad was out of town. Dad had been kind of running around doing dad things instead of running his empire. And so that's why Belshazzar offers Daniel not the second, but the third place in the kingdom. And all the king's wise men came in. They could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation. Again, we've seen this before now. And then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed. He's got no answer. Boy, have we seen this dynamic before, right? Again, now we're getting used to this. We know where this is going. We know what God's trying to say. Now to another generation in Babylon, even though Daniel's still there. So Belshazzar was greatly alarmed. His face grew even paler. His nobles were perplexed. The queen entered the banquet hall. Because of the words of the kings and his nobles. And the queen spoke and said, "O king, live forever." And there's a good chance that this queen here is really the queen mother, somebody who's older, because of what she's about to say. "O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you or your face be pale. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is a spirit of the holy gods in the days of your father." And here probably the right sense is founding father, your ancestor, because technically Nebuchadnezzar was not the father of Nabopolassar Nabonidus or Belshazzar. So it's more like the sense of the founding father, the one who established the dynasty or the empire. But in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, who's been dead for decades by that point, in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom, like wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. This was because an extraordinary spirit, knowledge, and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, solving of difficult problems were found in Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation. And so Daniel was brought in before the king. And the king spoke to Daniel and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel, who was one of the exiles of Judah?" Boy, we've done something with that before, haven't we? No matter how long you serve, how well you do your job, who are you still to the world? You're just that guy. You're just that Jewish exile. Is that you? And by the way, isn't it stunning to tell you how depraved it was? Daniel's forgotten by everybody but the few of the old guard who are still around. Daniel's forgotten. And that's important. We'll come back to that as well in a minute. But notice that he doesn't really know who Daniel is. Someone has to remind him, we've got this guy. He's still on the payroll. He's a pensioner now. I don't know. But he's still around. The old guard, one of the old guard, the queen mother remembers him. "Are you that Daniel, though?" he asks, verse 13. "One of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah. Now I have heard about you, that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that illumination, insight, extraordinary wisdom have been found in you." At least that's what it says on LinkedIn. "Just now the wise men and the conjurers were brought in before me, that they might read this inscription and make its interpretation known to me, but they could not declare the interpretation of the message. But I personally have heard about you, that you are able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Now, if you are able to read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, you will be clothed with purple and wear a necklace of gold around your neck and have authority in all the kingdom." All right, so let's stop and let's unpack for a minute here now what's going on. That word suddenly matters, because again, you have what was the ultimate PR party. The king's not worried, neither should you be. In fact, let's bring out reminders of old times and old times' sake. Kind of reminds me of the hotel Saturday night when I checked in here. The place was jumping. The lady tells me you got the last place in the room, and it's obviously there's lots of people around and stuff's going on in the ballrooms and conference rooms. And I say, what's going on? They say, oh, it's a Frito-Lay employee alumni gathering. And there were cops there. I was like, wow, man, kind of got out of hand, huh? And they're like, no, actually they have some old memorabilia there. It's really valuable, so there's a cop there to guard it. I didn't know Frito-Lay potato chips were memorabilia, but somebody. But that's what you do, right? Alumni reunions, PR purposes, build spirit. You bring out the old stuff. And so here they are. They're partying. They're partying with God's stuff. Remember that time we took out Jerusalem? Boy, those were good days. And suddenly, you have a scene of great confidence and carelessness, of great fun and frolic, and instantly, suddenly, it's now party over, lights out. And what you have is abject, absolute terror and confusion. That word suddenly matters, folks, because folks, and listen to me, especially young people, that's how life works. That's how life works. We put our hope and our confidence in the silver, the gold, the treasures of this world, the lives that it makes possible in this age. We put all our hope and our confidence and our expectation and our dreams and our power, our position, our popularity, our wealth. And in a verse, in a moment, in a phone call, in an email, it all changes. And we're faced with a situation where we have no answer, no idea what's going on or what to do. And all the problems of life, all the fallenness of the world, all the fact that at the end of the day, we all get sick and die in the end. All that we try to push off and put out of our minds, suddenly life pushes it back before us. That's how life works. And in those moments, our materialism and our pleasure give us no hope and no answer. It always fails us at the worst possible time, at the most difficult of moments. And so here's the, up until that point, most powerful man in the world, in the greatest city the world has yet seen, presiding over what has been up until that point the most powerful empire the world has ever seen. And just like that, suddenly, all the confidence, all the bravado, all the performance art, all the security of the walls and the military, with the secure water supply, we're not really in that big of a difficulty or a tight strait here. All the boasting and previous great memories in times past, it all means nothing. From triumph to terror, from partying to prostrate, from supreme to speechless, suddenly, just like that, because that's how life works, and that's how God gets our attention sometimes. And so we have our saying today, can you not see the handwriting on the wall? And the king does all that he can do as a man of the world, a man of Babylon. He just offers more of Babylon to anybody who can help him in that moment, because that's all he has, that's all he knows, that's all he thinks in terms of. His world is actually, despite the fact that he runs the greatest empire that the world has seen up until that point, even though he's about to lose it, he can think no bigger than Babylon. And so the fact of the matter is, even no matter how great or how powerful or how much you have in this world, and again, young people, listen to me on this, if all you can think of and hope in is this world, you are actually one of the most smallest-minded people of all. Even if you have all that this world has to offer. Because if your horizon of thinking, imagination, and hope is this present age alone, your world is way too small. And isn't it interesting? The king is terrified when he doesn't even know what it says yet. How does he not know it's one of his own gods who's sending him a message? Saying, hey, don't worry, victory's at hand, or hey, you're going to live another 50 years, or hey, there's a pony outside for you. I mean, how does he not know it's good news? Why is he terrified? Knees knocking. Maybe it's because the truth of the matter is, in moments like that, hard times in life, then and now, the truth of the matter is we deep down know it all along, but it's only in those most desperate moments that we are forced to confess and admit that the world and its gods, and yeah, we still worship gods, money, power, career, education, they're gods, that those gods have nothing in the most difficult of moments. And that the problem Belshazzar has is that his gods, the world's gods, don't do this. He knows that deep down. He knows that deep down. He knows Bel, Marduk. He knows Ashtaroth and Ishtar. He knows they don't do this. But the God who used to own the cup I'm getting drunk from right now, I've heard stories that he does things like this. And that's probably not good news for me. And so the queen, probably the queen mother, tries to give comfort, recommends calling for Daniel, who again would be an older gentleman by now. He's been he's probably in his 70s at this point in the story. He's been put out the pasture most likely by the newer, younger regime. Isn't that what happens, right? New, younger CEO comes in, and what happens to all the guys in their 50s and 60s from the old CEO? They get reassigned, furloughed, offered buyouts, etc. Daniel was offered his severance package, and he was shoved out perhaps. But now one of the old guard says, hey, this is a Daniel moment. This is a Daniel moment. And isn't it interesting? Again, just like in Daniel chapter 3 the other night, isn't it interesting that when all the other movers and shakers of the empire are gathered together, who's not there? Daniel. Again, he would have been old by this point, but still his reputation and the respect of him by those who still remembered him was strong. And his reputation and the respect with which he was held was so strong, again, that we talked about Sunday morning. The real shock is that he'll actually be kept around not just by the next king, but by the next empire. And so Daniel is summoned. And it's interesting, by the way, just as a sidebar, how often, well, yes, God created man to have the headship and the leadership in the home and the church. Isn't it interesting, though, so often as not, it's usually the woman who has to do the hard lifting and the heavy moments because we men fail so often. Let's be honest about that, brothers. How often is it in the Bible all the men are losing their heads and terrified, and it's the women who know what to do? I think about Deborah, I think about Hannah, I think about Abigail, I think about Mary, and on the list could go. And so Belshazzar has this conversation with Daniel. Again, remember, this is the Belshazzar who began the night by mocking the God of Daniel as he blasphemously partied with God's holy things to toast his own gods in the most delusional way. And now, with his own gods and his own advisors useless to him, maybe we better come back to Daniel and his God. You ever known somebody like that? And young people, you will know people like this in your life. You will know people like this in your life. They will mock you, whether to your face or behind your back, subtly or overtly. They will mock you. They will disparage you. They will think you odd or different. They will sometimes ostracize you or move you to the outside of the social circle because you go to church regularly, because you will not run and participate with them in the things that they do. But suddenly, when instantly happens to them, when their life hits the wall, then they want to know how you do it. Then they want to know what you've known all along. And boy, the challenge is to not give in to bitterness or resentment. Why was Daniel not there? I don't know, but I think it's highly probable he'd been put out to pasture. But he's not bitter or resentful in this moment because he realized he doesn't really work for any king of Babylon ever. His work has always been for the Lord. And so as far as that goes, he just recognizes I'm always on the clock in whatever situation God's providence puts me in. And so I will not give in to the bitterness, the resentment that I could rightfully even have towards these people, because I represent God's and God's interests always and everywhere in this. But most of us have known those who will mock us and ignore us until it's the lump in their breast, until it's their marriage that's falling apart, until it's their child that's pregnant or arrested or worse. And now, suddenly, they want you to pray with them. Now they want to find the one true God when their false gods and godless ways have failed them in the greatest moment of need. And again, the integrity of Daniel, when Daniel is offered all this, he refuses the reward. He's not in it for the money. He wants no piece or part of Babylon, not in that way. Have your Bible. Let's read a little bit more. Beginning of verse 17. Daniel answered and said before the king, "Keep your gifts for yourself or give your rewards to someone else. I'm not in it for the money. Again, I don't really work for you technically. I work for God. However, I will read the inscription to the king and make the interpretation known to him. O king, the Most High God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar your father. Because of the grandeur which he bestowed on him, all the peoples, nations, men of every language, feared and trembled before him. Whomever he wished, he killed. Whomever he wished, he spared alive. And whomever he wished to elevate, he elevated. Whomever he wished, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit became proud, so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken away from him. He was also driven away from mankind, and his heart was made like that of beasts, and his dwelling place was with the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he recognized that the Most High God is the ruler of the realm of mankind, and that he sets it over whomever he wishes. Stop right there for a moment. Stop right there. And I want you to think about this. So what chapter 5 is saying is, hey, remember the story from last night? This is commentary still on that story. We'll see that even more in just a moment. This is commentary on last night's story. Last night's story really is the pinnacle of the book in terms of God is always in control. Be careful you don't wind up with a worldly view of history, just like we don't want a worldly view of science. God is always in control of these things. This is the center of the book. This is the heart of the message. Yes, there's moral applications for how you and I should live, but the reason you and I have the courage to live morally, we talked about last night, is because of chapter 4 and chapter 5. God is always on top of it. And isn't it interesting, again, how the story is told matters. It's so hard sometimes because we're so familiar with these stories. It's so hard sometimes to really catch fully what's going on because of the familiarity. In the heart of the book, chapter 4 and chapter 5, think about this. Chapter 4, not only is Nebuchadnezzar humbled, but just to show you how little a lifespan or a man's life is in God's eyes. Literally, that's also the end of Nebuchadnezzar in the story. He disappears. Yes, he may have reigned for years more in actual life, but the way God sees it, Nebuchadnezzar is dust after that. He's gone from the story. He's now just a distant memory in chapter 5. And not only that, but as God takes care of the arrogant man coming out of chapter 4, where he just disappears with a turn of a page, despite the fact that he was one of the world's greatest rulers up to that point in history. But now we literally fast forward as we go from chapter 4, and Nebuchadnezzar, who reigns all the way into the 560s, we fast forward decades to 539, and not just anywhere, but we fast forward all the way to the last night of Babylon. The man goes away with the turn of a page, and with another turn of the page, the empire as well, just to underscore for the reader. God means business when he says, I bring up and I take down. And you may marvel and build museums and write history books and tell stories and ooh and ah and go on tourism vacations and want to see all this stuff. But for God, the turn of a page and it's all dust. And so with the turn of a page, the man is gone. And with the turn of a page, it's literally the final hours of Babylon, because it's nothing to God. And Daniel is trying to remind Belshazzar of this principle in this most important of moments. But read on verse 22. Yet you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart. And here come the most damning words of all. Even though you knew all this. Even though you knew all this. Why is Belshazzar on the brink of hell in this moment? Because he knew this, and what did he do anyways? He partied like it's 1999. And you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels. See, yeah, God saw that. They have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your nobles, your wives, your concubines have been drinking wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze, iron, wood, stone, which do not see, do not hear, do not understand. But the God in whose hand are your life breath. We talked about that last night, right? In his hand are your life breath and your ways. Him you have not glorified. We talked about that last night too. Then the hand was sent from him, and this inscription was written. Now this inscription that was written is this: Mene, Mene, Tekel Upharsin. And this is the interpretation of the message. Mene. God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. And the fact that it's repeated the way it was written, the fact it's repeated, that's God's way of saying it is certain, it is sure. It is sure. In Hebrew, that's often how things were communicated as is certainty. You repeated them, you doubled them up. Like for instance, in Hebrew, back when God first warned Adam and Eve, if you eat of that forbidden fruit of that forbidden tree, you're going to die. Literally in Hebrew, the way it reads is, dying you will die. And usually in English it's surely you will die, but no, in Hebrew it's just it's the verb for dying twice. Dying, you will die. You are certainly going to die. God has thoroughly numbered you. What's the idea of numbering here? The idea of numbering in this context is thoroughly taking stock of what you're doing. Some of you who work in sales or something like that, you ever have times when your business takes inventory? We go all through the warehouse and we want to make sure every UPC code, every barcode, everything's accounted for. We want to know what's here. God has mene. He has numbered you thoroughly. He has counted every hair on your head. He has counted every soldier and every grain of sand in your empire. He has thoroughly taken an inventory of this situation. He has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, which is also the same word from which we get the word shekel. Shekel, we remember, is a unit of money, but what it really was, it was a weight of money. Because back in those days, you weighed, just like it used to be before we went off the gold standard. There was so much gold, right? Our coinage and our money used to be, there was a certain weight, a certain amount of precious metal, right? And so here's what the idea now. Not only have I taken thorough inventory of you, I have looked you over, turned you every which way, your empire, everything. But I have also weighed you. I have also weighed you. The image of the scales of justice, like the statue before the Supreme Court where justice is blindfolded to represent equal justice before the law. In theory, justice ought to be practiced in the way that is blind, no favoritism between rich and poor, white and black. At its best, yes, we've had our flaws in this country, but that's the ideal. And how do you determine justice? You weigh. And God says, I've weighed you, and my justice is determined that you are deficient. My view of justice sees your time is up and your judgment as at hand. And then Peres, which is a word in the ancient languages that does mean divided, but here's the fun wordplay here. Peres sounds like Persian in their language and in ours. The P, the R, the S. God's got a sense of humor, even in the darkest of moments. That's a wordplay he throws in there. It is a verb for dividing that he uses, but divided in the sense of given to the Persians. You hear that word in that, you hear that Persian in that last word. Your kingdom has been divided and given over to them. And here's how obtuse the man is, verse 29, right? Here's how obtuse he is. So Belshazzar gave orders, and despite Daniel's original rejection of the offer, what did they do? Because a man who's so steeped in Babylon, and by the way, this is the tragedy of those who are lost in the end. They are so steeped in Babylon, they are so full of the world, that even when you show them all this, and you teach them this, and you explain this to them, their mind is so darkened, they are so captive to the thought ways of the world. That's why the Bible says you've got to be transformed by the renewing of your mind. When your mind is so thoroughly warped by the world, you can't even see or hear or listen or understand when somebody offers you God's truth. And that's how far gone Belshazzar is. Because despite everything that's just been said, what does he do? The only thing a man who is Babylon embodied can do. He gives him more of Babylon anyways. And they clothed Daniel with purple, put a necklace of gold around his neck. He issued a proclamation concerning him that he had authority as the third ruler in the kingdom for about 3 more hours. And then here's our last way of coming around to suddenly. That very night, Belshazzar was slain. That very night, Belshazzar was slain. Daniel didn't want the reward. For him, it was simply about serving God. Not using God or God's ways as a ladder to move higher, to climb up further in this world, this age. Daniel has tried to remind Belshazzar of the truth, but Belshazzar is too warped of a man to understand. And the tragic irony for Belshazzar is his reward won't even last the night. Something so many would have wanted and strived for, the gold, the glory, the purple, the title, the position, and it won't even last the night. So much of what we strive for, folks, and especially young people, hear me and hear me well. It's great to go to school or go in the military or learn a trade. It's great to have dreams of having a family and things like that. Those are worthy and good things in of themselves, but never make them your gods, because so quickly can it all be gone and all be over. Because God reigns and rules in the affairs of men. And suddenly is how the world works. And all Belshazzar can offer Daniel is stuff that wouldn't last the night, something so many again would have strived for, betrayed for, and many have over the centuries sold their very souls to have. And what does it matter when everything is about to change? So why do I call this the world's last night? Because this was the end of the world as those folks knew it. That's how God's judgment works. When an era ends, when a nation falls, it's the end of the world as those folks have known it. The world has ended for them. Those of us who are old enough to remember 9/11, you remember how you felt that morning, September 11th? Those of us who are old enough to remember those days? You remember what it was like going to the airport before September 11th, 2001? Yeah, good times. I remember one time in 1998 was running late for a plane. I was in St. Louis, Missouri, running late for a plane. Was waved through security. I think I technically went through a metal detector. Nobody ever checked my ID, got on the plane. Today it's a federal crime, and I'd still be locked up. September 11th, 2001, for many of us, was a day in which the world as we knew it ended. And those of you who are of age and remember that, you know what I'm talking about. It wasn't just the airports that changed. Our mentality changed. Our view of the world changed. As Americans collectively, we've been at war for 20 years because of what happened September 11th, 2001. The very mentality of the gentle giant of the United States changed. What certain radical groups in the world learned the hard way is what the Japanese learned in World War II. Don't wake the sleeping tiger. We're not a warlike people, but when you rattle us, and that was the thing, it was fear. We were, honestly, we wouldn't confess this on the world stage. Our presidents postured and our politicians said what they needed to say, but the truth of that is we responded in a lot of ways in fear. We had been rattled. We had been struck on our own soil. Our sense of security suddenly was gone. Because I don't know about you, but I remember watching Monday Night Football on September 11th, 2001. It was the Denver Broncos playing somebody else. I don't remember who. I just remember the game because Ed McCaffrey, one of the great receivers, I think, of that era in the NFL, broke his leg that game. I was like, oh, man, Ed broke his leg. That's tough. Went to bed that night, staying up later than I should have. I had work the next morning. Stayed up later than I should have. And you know what happened next. 1 minute you're watching Monday Night Football and the world as you know it goes on, and you're in your mid-20s thinking life is good. And suddenly, the world as I had known it, the world as some of you had known it, was gone forever. Literally now a world that our children have never known and will never know. Have your Bible still? Turn with me to the book of Revelation, chapter 17. Book of Revelation, chapter 17. One of our great watchwords this week has been, it's always Babylon out there. And that is something that's a biblical insight. You know, remember Sunday we looked at 1 Peter chapter 5, where Peter, writing from the city of Rome, kind of reminds Christians that it's Babylon. He's writing from Babylon because Rome was the great city of the first century when the apostles roamed the earth. In the book of Revelation, even though in its original setting, I believe describes not the end of the world, but the end of a world, the end of the Roman world, when God was going to bring judgment on the Roman Empire for its many sins, when it was numbered and weighed and divided, and its time had come. But the fact of the matter is why we read these last bits as we close tonight is because this is the way God always works. This is the way God worked in Babylon in the 5th or 6th century BC. This is the way God worked in the 1st century AD. And this is still the way God works in the 21st century AD. And so I begin in Revelation chapter 17, where I've asked you to read with me. Verse 1, then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls, and listen, there's a lot of imagery here we don't have time to unpack. That's another series for another time. But I want you to see something I think can become obvious enough. 7 angels had 7 bowls. One of them came and said to me, come, John, I will show you the judgment. The judgment. It's a scene of judgment we're about to see. I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on the earth have become drunk, just like Belshazzar was literally doing on the night in which his empire died. And he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness. And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 horns and 10 heads. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, just like Babylon always is of any era. It looks great. We've talked about that some this week. How it looks from human eyes versus how it looks from God's perspective. She looks good. This is a well-dressed prostitute, arrayed in purple and scarlet, gold, jewels, pearls, holding in her hand the golden cup full of abominations and impurities of her sexual immorality. Because just like Belshazzar's last night, the world always uses pleasure, drunkenness, sex, you name it. It always uses pleasure to distract us from the reality of our predicament. Always. Kids, young people, that is Satan's playbook. That is what he has done for centuries and millennia. Don't fall for it. And on her forehead was written the name of mystery. And look at that. Who is she? Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. It's always Babylon out there. Rome is Babylon. And folks, we are Babylon today. Listen, when the world speaks your language to do business, when the world uses your reserve currency, or your currency as the reserve currency for the world, when everybody wants to do business with you, when everybody adjusts to your practices, when everybody wants access to your markets, you are the Babylon of your age. And so I ask you to turn the page to chapter 18. And this is the last thing we'll read. Having established that here is Babylon, this great prostitute, well-dressed, rich, comfortable, pleasure-seeking, debauched. After this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his glory. And he called out with a mighty voice, Fallen is Babylon the Great. You see, the world always ends. There's always the world's last night for somebody somewhere as history goes on. Eventually it will be the world's last night, but this happens over and over again in history. But I want you to notice what it looks like for them, because I think it might echo a little bit for us in ways that ought to sober us as the people of God. Fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean, detestable beast. We saw that Sunday morning, didn't we? Remember Isaiah 13 describing what God would do to literal Babylon? For all nations, when everybody wants to do business with you folks, when everybody wants access to your markets, and notice that most of what we're going to see here, it's about the economy, stupid. Remember the old Bill Clinton saying, it's about the economy? He was right as far as that goes, humanly speaking. It is always about the economy. This chapter is about the original global economy. And watch what happens with Babylon sitting on top of it all. For all the nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. The kings of the earth have committed immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living. And as we keep reading here, I want you to notice how often the word luxury or luxurious shows up. This needs to sober us. This needs to sober us. Being rich. And I don't care what your financial status is tonight. Every last person in this room, by the Bible's standards, is rich. Let the reader understand. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, unlike the rest of the world who's joining in the party, come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues. For her sins are heaped high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Mene, tekel upharsin. Parents, teach this to your children. Pay her back as she herself has paid back others. 1 minute you're the one taking the vessels, the next minute the vessels are being taken from you. Pay her back as she herself has paid back others. Repay her double for her deeds. Mix a double portion for her in the cup she has mixed. She has glorified herself and, there it is again, lived in luxury. Folks, the American standard of living is spiritually dangerous. So give her like a like measure of torment and mourning, since in her heart she says, I sit as a queen, I am no widow, and mourning I shall never see. Or as we now put it here in this country, make America great again. We will never fall. We're just a little off our game right now, but the idea of a world without American leadership and dominance is a world that the rest of us cannot imagine. And yet, what does the Bible tell us? Unless Jesus comes back there, that world will exist someday. And it will be this world's last night. Our world's last night. I sit as a queen. I am no widow, and mourning I shall never see. I can't fall. We have F-22s and SEAL Team 6, etc., etc. We may be laughing at Russia's ineptness right now, but listen, God in heaven can find plenty of ways to make us look the fool when the time comes too. For this reason, her plagues will come in a single day. That's the New Testament version of suddenly. Death, mourning, famine, and she will be burned up with fire. Famine, we may not be there yet, but anybody kind of shocked grocery shopping lately? And she will be burned up with fire, for mighty is the Lord who has judged her. And the kings of the earth who committed sexual immorality and, there it is again, lived in luxury with her, will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. They will stand far off in fear of her torment and say, Alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city Babylon, for in a single hour, there it is again, suddenly, your judgment has come, and all the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore. That's the original supply chain snarl, folks. The terminology changes, but the concepts don't. When the globalized economy hits a snag, look, I'm not a prophet or a son of a prophet. Far be it from me to say for sure what God is up to. I just know this is the way God works. That's all I'm saying. And all the merchants of the earth will weep because no one buys their cargo anymore. But look at this, verse 12. Cargoes of gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple cloth, silk, scarlet cloth, all kinds of scented wood, all kinds of articles of ivory, all kinds of articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle, sheep, horses, chariots, slaves, that is, human souls. Look at the list of what luxurious living looks like, and let me ask you a humbling question tonight. If we were to turn this into a list with checks boxes, how many of those things are in your home? You realize, again, we don't think of ourselves as rich. You realize most of us have things in our home that literally the ancient kings didn't have much of. You realize what our modern global supply chains do? You get berries any season of the year, it doesn't matter, we'll import them from somewhere. And not just for the President of the United States and the Silicon oligarchs, people like you and me at Kroger. There it is. Cinnamon. That used to be a rare and treasured spice. Now we waste it on YouTube with the cinnamon challenge. And even that last one that haunts us a little bit, that is human souls. Ah, yeah, slavery. But you know, human trafficking's still a thing, even in this country. And you realize that a lot of our made-in-China products are made with modern slave labor, an awkward and unfortunate truth. It doesn't change, folks. We're still living in these stories. It's still there. And the fruit for which your soul longed has gone from you, and all your delicacies and your splendors are lost to you, and they will not be found again. And the merchants of these wares who gained wealth from her will stand far off in fear of her torment, weeping and mourning aloud. Alas, alas, for the great city that was clothed in fine linen and purple scarlet, adorned with gold, with jewels, with pearls. For in a single hour, there it is again. Boy, this seems like it comes out of nowhere. Just like COVID in 2020. Isn't that how it works? You have no idea one month, and then the next month, once again, the world as you know it is gone. In a single hour, all this wealth has been laid waste. And the stock market crashes, and the financial wizards are shocked, and the CEOs don't know what to do. And all the shipmasters and seafaring men and sailors and all whose trade is on the sea stood far off the ports of California and cried out as they saw the smoke of her burning. What city was like the great city? And they threw dust on their heads. They wept, they mourned, they cried, Alas, alas! For the great city where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth. For in a single hour, there it is again. This is how God keeps us on our toes, folks. She has been laid waste. That was the end of globalization in the first century. But what's interesting is for the people of God, even those who have to live through these hard times of God's judgment when the world as you know it ends. Look at what he says. If you truly have God's perspective, if you really are in Babylon but not out of Babylon, yeah, this may not be good for your 401k or your retirement plans or your real estate investments or whatever it is, but if you are truly in Babylon but not of Babylon, verse 20, rejoice, O heaven, and you saints and the prophets, apostles and prophets. Why? For God has given judgment for you against her. If you are not participating in this world, even if you have to suffer as the world falls, like Daniel and his friends did, you rejoice because you know that God is actually proving you are right and the world is wrong, even if the world still doesn't fully see it, just like Belshazzar did not. But who was proved right in Daniel chapter 5 when the dust settles? Daniel. And yeah, he had to go through another rise and fall, and I'm sure that was no fun. But God did it for him, and God does it for us. To prove that those who are in Babylon but not over Babylon are the ones who live and survive and even thrive. Maybe not materially, but we thrive spiritually and mentally and emotionally because we know whose we are and we know what kingdom we are from. But maybe we can't see it that way because we're more of Babylon than we realize. The world's last night, because for Babylon and for those in her it was. For those who shared Babylon's ways and values, it was. For those who lived their lives to have a share of Babylon's power and wealth, those who spend their lives today chasing a nice house and a good zip code with access to highly rated schools for their children, admission to the college of their first choice. That's the temptation, isn't it? Nothing wrong with those things in of itself, but that's why we get to see, because they're not sinful in themselves. But boy, is living luxuriously dangerous, Revelation tells us. It's hard to live in comfort and security, peace and prosperity and not become part of Babylon. And even if you and I don't live to see the end of this age, God alone knows how much he rattles before he pulls it all down. Even so, for you and I, every last one of us in this room, 100 years from now, even the youngest babe in arms won't be here anymore. When you die, the world ends for you, even if Jesus hasn't come back yet. And when nations fall, and the world, as those who have lived in that nation have known it, ends, again, remind ourselves that all of this is ultimately just a precursor to the true end of the world. The world really will have someday one last night. Not just for a city or for a nation, but for the entire planet. When Jesus comes back, and think about how it's described, like a thief in the night. And suddenly, this is not what the New Testament says about his coming too. Suddenly, in an instant, the trumpet sounds, and the heavens are rent, and all will see Jesus as he returns to carry out the ultimate mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. Revelation makes Babylon the precursor and the prototype to all the falls and ends within history. It's Roman Revelation, but ultimately the fall of Roman Revelation shades in the final chapters of Revelation, as many of us are familiar with, to the end itself. And only those who are able to rejoice at Babylon's fall, because we had no stake in Babylon herself, we wanted to see the vindication of God, his ways, and his people, will find themselves in that final city of God in the end. And so what about you tonight? What about your life? What about the ways you are living, the goals you are pursuing, what you're teaching your children? What about the accomplishments you've netted, the awards you've acquired, the network you've cultivated, the titles you've achieved, the portfolio you've invested in, the aspirations you have for your children? Because sometimes our children actually didn't want to go to A&M. We just pushed them there. And you've arranged all your life around that, your family, your time, your finances. This is what your children live for, to please you and prove to you that they are worthy heirs and successors of your Babylonish ways. Let me ask you something. What will be left of your life tonight if the U.S. suddenly, in an instant, fell tonight? Because that's how it happens, folks. Nobody ever sees the end of the world coming if they're in Babylon, because they're too much a part of Babylon to believe it could happen to them. What would be left of your life and how you've spent it if Jesus returned tonight? Because you realize at some point it's going to happen to somebody. And just like Babylon sits there and says, I will never fall, I will never be a widow, too often we sit there and say, he won't come back in my lifetime. All Belshazzar had was more of Babylon to give Daniel for a few hours until the end came. But Daniel wanted none of that. And again, as we've talked about this week, so when you turn the page, not only is Nebuchadnezzar gone, but Babylon's gone, but who's still there? Daniel. Daniel is still there. And you know who else is still there? God. And I want you to think about that. As we sing this final song tonight, I want you to think about really and truly where your life is. What's the handwriting on your wall? What would God say about you? How would God measure your life if the time came to take stock of who you are and how you've lived? And again, think about this. If this country fell, if this economy crashed, what would be left of your life, your hopes, your dreams? Because if you're truly one of the people of God, well, yes, it would be no fun to lose your house, to lose your investments, to eat a little bit less and go hungry a little bit more. But for those whose hope was in this world anyways, honestly, what would change? Folks, most of us are middle-aged in this room. 30, 40 more years tops? Maybe. Compared to what? Eternity? Make the right choice tonight. If you need to make your choice of getting right with God in whatever way it is, as we stand and as we sing.